Hello，大家好，欢迎回到外媒看中国，我是安博然。Activists in Washington, D.C. were arrested today after disrupting the first Select Committee hearing on economic cooperation with China, which many believe is just a thinly veiled way to continue pushing anti-China rhetoric to ordinary Americans in the hope of sparking a war. On today's show, we chat with Jodie Evans, head of the China is Not Our Enemy campaign. This is Reports on China. I'm Andy Boreham in Shanghai. Let's get reporting. Tonight, local time, Washington hosted its first select committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, which is supposedly meant to look at economic competition between China and the US. But it's clear that this angle is just a convenient front to continue pushing the China threat to ordinary Americans. CNBC, in a very rare example of Western media telling the truth in the first paragraph, had this to say. A newly formed House committee devoted to examining economic competition between the US and China is holding its first hearing on Tuesday night, capping off a day of maneuvers on Capitol Hill aimed at holding Beijing accountable for recent national security offences. Interestingly, they have put the lie and the reality in the same paragraph, starting off by claiming the Select Committee is devoted to examining economic competition between China and the US, and ending with the real motive, or at least one of them, to hold Beijing accountable for recent national security offences. Further down in the article, we see that the chairman of the committee, Mike Gallagher, explains more about their real motives. The CCP laughed at our naivete while they took advantage of our good faith, Gallagher will say of previous economic approaches by the US. But the era of wishful thinking is over. The Select Committee will not allow the CCP to lull us into complacency or maneuver us into submission. So there you have it, a Select Committee concerned more with continuing the China bad narrative and ultimately keeping the US in its hegemonic position, and not really at all about so-called economic competition. In fact, just one look at the 7 bills the group approved for consideration by the House and Senate shows even more clearly what this Select Committee is all about. With 3 of the 7 relating directly to Taiwan, which Washington is desperate to turn into another Ukraine. Just take a look. The Taiwan Conflict Deterrence Act of 2023, the Taiwan Non-Discrimination Act of 2023, and the Protect Taiwan Act. By the way, I'm not sure why they're listed as acts, since they're not yet law and instead should be referred to as bills. Some Americans are doing their best to stand up to Washington's warmongering tactics, though, with CODEPINK, a group of female activists for peace, disrupting the event before being arrested. Let's take a look.
And perhaps most important, the committee can help determine the combinations of policies and legislation necessary to counter CCP aggression and rebuild America's and the free world's competitive advantages.
Joe McMaster, why don't you pause for a second? You'll be given additional time and we'll take care of this.
Wow, Trump's former national security advisor, McMaster, was interrupted there during the hearing and stated that the protesters must be victims of Chinese communist propaganda. What a deep and reasoned response there. One of the CODEPINK crew who were there when another member was arrested made this infuriating observation on Twitter. Media Benjamin wrote, "How ironic. After CODEPINK protested at congressional hearing on China, the witness bragged that, unlike in China, people in the US have the right to free speech. Here's what happened when Olivia Danucci exercised her right to free speech and called for peace with China." How absolutely infuriating. Now I'm honoured to have on the show Jodie Evans, who's the co-founder of CODEPINK and head of their China is Not Our Enemy campaign. Jodie, thank you so much for coming at such short notice.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. We've just watched the video of CODEPINK's disruption of the US House Select Committee hearing. But first up, I'm quite curious about the safety of your crew, like Olivia DiNucci, who we just watched get arrested in that video. So what is the normal process there? Will she be charged with anything, and when will she be released?
So thank you for asking about Olivia. It's been a hard day for her because just getting ready to enter a hearing and stand up is nerve-wracking. And so I just want to call out her courage and her commitment that, nobody wants to hear about peace in the United States. We've been shut out. The media has been told they can't talk about it. They can't cover our protests. So the only way that we can really get in the way of this warmongering is to stand up in hearings and say peace, which seems to frighten everyone. It's such a silly thing that peace is so frightening to all these warmongers. Olivia was arrested. She was taken to jail, and she's now out. She was charged and given a court date, and she'll have to show up for the court date. Unfortunately, we have another disruption we had planned for International Women's Day, and she probably won't be able to lead that because of the this arrest.
Oh, well, I definitely wish her luck. So the US House Select Committee on the Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party hearing, such a mouthful, claims to be about economic competition between the two countries. But committee chairman Mike Gallagher's rhetoric was quite pointed, I thought. So I was wondering, in your view, what is the actual aim of this select committee?
So the aim of this select committee, as has been the aim since Obama did the pivot to Asia, has been this building of hate and distrust and fear of China. And so, it's a lot of, hate-filled, ridiculous rhetoric that is why Olivia stood up. Because you have to understand, this is the first time in the history of the United States that there is a committee like this, a committee that is targeted on a country. So already this is a first. And so, we knew from when it got started, and by the way, it's a Republican-led Congress that allowed this to happen. There were only 62 Democrats that voted against it. But to put that in context, there were only 30 Democrats who called on Biden for diplomacy with Ukraine. So we actually had more votes on blocking this China warmongering committee. And this we could see from this hearing. First of all, it's also the first time we've ever seen in the 20 years I've been doing this, a prime time Senate hearing that was scheduled for the night. So this is special. This is, super propaganda for war. And, why did I start the China's Not Our Enemy campaign was because 3 years ago, all of a sudden, I noticed this coordinated effort of hate on China. And I'm like, why is all this hate on China happening? What did China do? Why? And then I know how to see it. And like every media outlet was having the same story. And I'm like, oh, this is propaganda for war. This is just like Iraq. And that's when I started the China's Not Our Enemy campaign, because I was like, oh dear, I have to get in the way of this before it's too late. Because once, the fog of war starts, getting people out of the fog of war, it's very hard. And so for the last 3 years, we've been trying to pull people out of this draw into hate around China. One of the things has been that there's already been casualties from the war on China that the U.S. is driving, and they're Asian Americans, because all this hate on China is driving hate crime against Asians in America. And I say Asians because in America, nobody can tell the difference. So any Asian is getting the attack. And, so this is just another one of those tools, like that ridiculous balloon that we saw a few weeks ago that was called a spy balloon. I mean, how ridiculous and stupid was that? It only made journalists and American citizens look even dumber, because just to name a weather balloon a spy balloon when that just doesn't even make sense. And, it's shameful. It's actually just shameful. What's happening in the United States right now and how people are behaving and what they're believing. And I think it also goes to the response of President Biden to Xi's 12-point peace proposal, because he said it's not rational. And that's the most irrational thing I think he could have said. It's a peace plan that calls for dialogue and negotiation, which is the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis. So the irrationality in the United States that happens when, I guess the country is afraid it's losing its global hegemony, and so it's going to take on everyone, which, it doesn't serve anyone in the world, and it certainly doesn't serve the United States citizens. In the last 20 years on the war on Iraq and Afghanistan have cost U.S. taxpayers $21 trillion. And I say that word, most of the ills of citizens in the United States could have been taken care of with that $21 trillion.
I totally agree. It's definitely disheartening, and I'm really glad you're doing the work you're doing. But with the growing tensions between China and the US over the past few years, how important is it to let ordinary Americans know that China is not that evil threat that it's really portrayed as in the Western media? And in your opinion, where are we heading if this level of anti-China rhetoric continues unabated?
Well, that's why I started this committee, is that I'm trying to get in the way of it, because what it does do is it drives U.S. people, crazy, and then they want a war because they've been frightened and they feel like there's an enemy and it's out to get them. But it's not true. China doesn't have any bases anywhere around the United States when the United States has 250 bases circling China. So it's kind of the pot calling the kettle black that we see with the United States, but it's frightening. And I think, it's kind of, the balloon story is a joke. It's a horrible joke, but it's not a joke, because we're talking about two nuclear armed countries. And that's not a joke. That's very serious. It's unimaginable to me that the United States could even think of going to war on China. But I have stood in this moment of this is unimaginable, and I have watched the unimaginable happen. I mean, it's unimaginable that the United States could be calling Cuba a terrorist country, a country of people that are doctors for the world. It's called a terrorist country, where the United States has caused, weapons have killed, I think, 350,000 people in Yemen in the last 5-6 years, where we've got sanctions that I've literally witnessed what's happening in Iran with U.S. sanctions that have, just eviscerated the entire middle class of Iran. I mean, this kind of human abuse it's unimaginable, yet it's happening. And what we did to Iraq, we destroyed two countries, Iraq and Afghanistan. And that we have abandoned Afghanistan and the women of Afghanistan and are, actually holding the money that could be paying for teachers while they're going through a freezing winter. It's, not a pretty picture.
Yeah, it's interesting that you speak about Iraq, because you've had first-hand experience of the devastation there that came from the US government being hell-bent on using the media to basically terrify a population and convince them that war was the only answer.
And yet the people of Iraq were beautiful and kind and generous and thoughtful. When I first met them, I couldn't believe how kind they were being. And I said, but, we're coming from the United States. We're about to bomb you. And they said, well, you're not Bush and we're not Saddam. We're Iraqis and you're Americans. Really beautiful people. And so many of my friends that I met then are living really, really hard lives after what we did to Iraq, with no apology, no accountability, and no responsibility. But not only that, I went to Afghanistan when Obama was threatening to escalate there, and brought back 4,000 signatures from women in Afghanistan begging him not to escalate, because that escalation has been really what has devastated Afghanistan, and he didn't care. So the cold-heartedness and the blindness of power in Washington, D.C., I'm all too familiar with, and it's frightening.
Well, I was wondering if you see any correlations, perhaps, between the current US push for conflict with China and the Iraq invasion 20 years ago.
Well, they probably have different goals. They had different goals, I'm sure. But what's the same is the pattern used to drive the U.S. to war. And it's lies and propaganda. And the lies and propaganda around China are so thick and so deep and so racist because it's really quite shameful how racist it is, the xenophobia, and how inhuman. The stories that people are willing to believe and take for granted, that, instead of really understanding what China is, or understanding that a country of almost 1,500,000,000 people is as diverse as anything anyone could imagine, and to call it, Chinese one thing and name it and, be divisive around it. It's simple-minded. It's as simple-minded as what's happening with Ukraine, where it's kind of like a comic strip. Putin is the evil monster and Zelensky is the, shining hero on the mountain. It's just so simplistic and silly that Americans don't understand the complexity of world politics and what's happening and why. And, the complexities that we see with Europeans in their streets complaining about the war and protesting about the war because it's affecting the people of Europe, it's affecting the people of Africa. But who's listening? Not those, not those in the United States with the hubris to think that they run the world and want to hold on to their hegemony at the cost of God knows what, the future of everyone on the planet.
Exactly. Hey, speaking of silliness, I noticed some comments on your CODEPINK video tonight suggesting that you're paid by the CCP. So I wanted to ask you directly, do you receive any funding or support from the Chinese government?
No, nor do I know anyone in the Chinese government. I'm a peace activist. This is what's so silly, is that people can't see the truth. I don't know what happens is that my life has been committed to peace, and that what's happening is where I need to show up as a peace activist because war is being driven by lies and hate. That's what I do with my entire life. Why would somebody think China is paying me for it? I mean,
that's the thing.
That's as insulting to me as they are constantly insulting anyone who has any sense of decency and humanity. It's shameful and embarrassing.
It really is. I totally agree. So the last question tonight, because I know it's very late there, what can ordinary Americans do to better understand China and I guess to help try and stop their government from edging towards military conflict?
So at CODEPINK for the last 3 years, we've been creating webinars. And so we have lots of brilliant people from around the world to educate you out of the miseducation, from China, from Taiwan, from Africa, to help people better understand this propaganda. So you can find that at codepink.org/China. And I think we have, about 40 of them. I also urge Americans to subscribe to the Dongsheng News because they're really dumb when they talk about China. And I find in that 2 minutes that where you hear Tings give you the 2 minutes each Friday, just to be able, I call it to floss your brain with some facts instead of propaganda. It's quite easy. And then it starts to build for you a human relationship with another place instead of this false propaganda driven, toxic waste that gets into your brain. So I always encourage people to subscribe to the Dongsheng News, because it's really unbelievable how little people in the United States know about China. I mean, they repeat things to you, and it was like China 40 years ago. And I think it's also hard for people in the United States to understand that a country could have changed as vastly as China has changed in 40 years. Because nothing changes here, it just gets worse. So I think it would be kind of frightening to their psyche to have to accept how much a country can respond to the needs of its people and change. And not only the needs of its people, but the needs of the world. I think that's a frightening concept for US citizens to have to accept. But I hope we can help them accept it and be at our side calling for cooperation and friendship, because that's what we need.
I wholeheartedly agree. Jodie Evans, co-founder of CODEPINK, thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.
Well, that is it for today's show, you guys. As always, I'd love to hear what you think, and do let me know down below. Also, don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.